All right. So we come to the final presentation of the evening before the workshops, which will be held shortly after that. The final presentation, this person needs no introduction to the community. Rebecca Forgay is an experienced curator and educator with an academic background in women's studies and Jewish studies. Since 2011, she's been a director and CEO of the Jewish Museum of Australia. Rebecca and her partner of almost 20 years are parents to a beautiful 15-month-old boy and 2 middle-aged dogs.
Put that down, is that right?
No, that's fine.
I don't know why I make such a big deal. In fact, we're together for 20 years. It makes me sound very old. We were just children when we got together, of course. Good evening, everyone. I've been asked today, and I guess to present this final presentation before the workshops, and to talk today on the topic that was kind of presented to me was being Jewish and LGBTI are not mutually exclusive. And I guess I wanted to start by saying that in some sense that's totally obvious because all of the speakers here today are Jewish and LGBTI. So it's kind of taken for granted that it is the case that they are indeed not mutually exclusive. But I guess what I just wanted to do today was to really just unpack some of those areas in which it may seem like they might be mutually exclusive, or for some people they are. And I want to say also that as it happens in my case, they absolutely have not been. The point I want to make as well in Gavi's presentation, I noticed somewhere on the last slide, one of the points that were made was some of the, in terms of some of the ways of treating people, one of the things that we can do is to show people that it is possible to live happy Jewish lives if you are LGBTI. And certainly that's, I guess, the message of my presentation, because my experience as a lesbian and being Jewish has been predominantly a really positive one. So the story that what I want to talk to you about tonight, I want to say very clearly is my personal experience. I'm not a professional in this area at all. I don't work in this space, so I'm not bringing a great deal of professional knowledge or research. It's really a personal story. And I'm not going to try to generalise it, but I do hope that something of what I have to say has some relevance and some meaning to other people here as well. I guess also I wanted to say that one of the reasons I suppose I've been asked specifically to address this topic tonight is because I am so publicly involved in the Jewish community. I've worked for many years professionally in the Jewish community, and I have a leadership role in the Jewish community today. And I have been, for many years, openly a lesbian. And people, I guess, might wonder how it is that I've been able to work in the Jewish community, how I've wanted to, has it been hard for me, and perhaps why I have, given that that's the case, what it's been like for me. And the fact is that I'm really pleased to say, and perhaps really lucky to say, that it really mostly hasn't been a problem. Perhaps for me, as I said, it is partly that I've been lucky, and I haven't really encountered a great deal of homophobia within the Jewish community. But I also want to say, and I guess this is really going to be a theme running through my presentation and is captured in the title that I've chosen to add on to the one that was presented to me, is that I've not let it be a problem. The fact is that I am a lesbian and I am Jewish, and I would never contemplate denying either aspect of myself. I believe I'm entitled to own them both, and no one is going to tell me that I'm not. My attitude that I've carried through, I guess, most of the last 20 years, and not all of it, and I'll start shortly and say not right from the very beginning, is encapsulated by a slogan that was around in the 1990s when I was at university, and which I've kind of paraphrased in my title. When I was at uni and came out, it was a slogan that was used by a group called Queer Nation, an activist group from New York. And I should explain, because we've been talking a lot about terminology and definitions here tonight, because not everyone may be aware, Because queer, people sometimes say, isn't queer a negative word? Isn't that an insulting term? And queer is a term that was historically used pejoratively to refer specifically to gay men, but in the 1990s it was reclaimed by the gay and lesbian community as a positive self-description. And it was used as a kind of umbrella term for all non-heterosexual sexualities. Now, the use of the term is debated within the LGBTI community and probably not as commonly used in that same way in particular as it was in the 1990s. And I don't really want to enter into the whole debate about the meaning of it or definition, because that's not the point. The point is about the sentiment expressed by the slogan, which I've used in my title, that was used by Queer Nation, which is, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." Now, Queer Nation, they talk about on their website in their history, they explain that their inaugural action takes place at Flutie's Bar, a straight hangout at South Street Seaport. The goal, to make clear to patrons that queers will not be restricted to gay bars for socialising and for public displays of affection. This action becomes known as Nights Out. So what this group was saying is that we're not going to just hang out in gay bars and be gay there. We're going to be here. We're going to be where you are. We're going to be wherever we want to be. We are here, we're queer, and it's not our problem. If you have a problem, it's yours, and get used to it. Now, that was a pretty kind of bolshy, defiant attitude for an activist group to take. And I have to say that I'm not a great activist particularly, and I've never really been strongly political or activist around my sexuality. But the phrase has always really resonated for me, more just in terms of its plain statement of fact. I am, as I said before, I am a lesbian, I'm Jewish, I'm here, and all I can do is be who I am and do what I do. And everyone else, until someone tells me that I can't carry on doing that, and if they were, I'd probably challenge them anyway. But until someone says otherwise, then I'm sorry, but everyone else is going to have to get used to that, because I don't believe that there's any reason why I can't be all of those things at once. Now, I want to unpack this a little bit further in what I'm going to call 3 different spheres of being lesbian and Jewish: in the family, in the community, and in Jewish tradition. I want to start with the family. So a little bit about my story. As I said, as you heard in my introduction, I got together with my partner, Debbie, 19 years ago. We were both 21 years old. I didn't have the experience that some of the other speakers have talked about tonight of feeling isolated and discriminated against going through at school, because when I was at school, I wasn't a lesbian. When I was at university in my early years, I also wasn't, although I did have a shaved head, blue hair. I was vegetarian, and therefore someone who I went to school with and ended up becoming very involved with the Young Liberals, not to say anything about his political orientation, but he used to tell me that because of all of those things that I was in fact a Trotskyist lesbian. So I didn't know what a Trotskyist was, and I knew that I wasn't a lesbian, but at the time. Nevertheless, we did eventually get together when we were both 21. And I have to say, for quite some time after we first got together, aside from one close friend each who we both decided to confide in, we actually didn't tell anyone about our relationship. Eventually, though, after quite some time, we did come out to our friends and to our families. And talking about our families now, I do have to say it probably took our families a little while to all get used to it. One of the particular tensions started to arise after quite some time when we, as many couples who are together for a while and decide that they're really going to bring their lives more and more together, decide, if they're Jewish particularly, that they want to spend Friday nights together, that they're no longer going to split up and one's going to go to one family and the other's going to go to the other family. It's no, we're together, we're going to go to Shabbat dinner together now. So I have to say that that's really where some of the most significant tension started to arise over my and Debbie's relationship. It was about coming to Friday night dinner, and it was always the question for me, is Debbie welcome? And I don't want to have to ask every single time, is it okay if I bring Debbie? I wanted it to be a given, taken for granted, that it was okay that she could come. And in fact, that's just what I did. I just made it a given, and I made it okay that every fortnight, when we weren't going to her family's, we were coming to mine, that she was going to come. And I have to say, to this day, I'm grateful for Debbie for enduring what were some very uncomfortable Friday nights, because for quite some time it was uncomfortable for everyone, for us all to be forced together in that way. But as I said, I wasn't prepared to accept that I had to make a choice. I knew this is my family and I wasn't prepared to give that up. I knew this was the person that I'd come to love and I'd come to realise I was going to share the rest of my life with, and I wasn't going to give that up either. So you know what? Everyone was just going to have to get used to it. And I think that this tension around family is why a lot of LGBTI people perhaps feel like they can't be who they are in terms of their sexuality or gender identity and Jewish, because of the rejection or difficulty that they have with their family, and their family was where they experience so much of their Jewishness. So if they can't have that relationship with their family, they also become deprived of their Jewishness. And they face that choice that I think Margot was talking about at the beginning, that we either have to choose one or the other. And I think many people do end up at some point in that situation. As I said, though, for me, there was never going to be any choice. As hard it was going to be, I was going to make everyone ride it out. And I have to tell you, it was hard for everyone at certain points along the way, but we were all just going to get used to it. Eventually, though, everyone came around, and I think it's fair to say that everyone, my family and Debbie, there's acceptance and love all around the table for everyone now. And I think that probably most Jewish parents and most other parents actually do eventually come round, because really what they want ultimately is for their kids to be happy and to be loved. So I want to move on now to that second sphere in terms of being Jewish and in my case being a lesbian, and that is particularly in the Jewish community, and particularly for me that was in my professional life, because I've worked for so many years in the Jewish community. Now again, a lot of people might choose to just remove themselves from Jewish community life when they come out, assuming that it would be a problem, assuming that they wouldn't be welcome. And in fact, maybe because they've had that experience that they haven't been welcome. Again, it never even occurred to me that it should be a problem for me to continue working in the Jewish community the way that I had done before I came out as a lesbian. And I have to say, in all my years working in the Jewish community, and most of those years were working where I now work at the Jewish Museum of Australia, I in fact mostly never had any issues, except for once, which I state really as a comment to say that it really was the exception, not the rule. And I'm going to tell about this incident without naming any names. I'd been working at the Jewish Museum and I'd curated an exhibition about Shabbat. And I had been invited to speak at an Orthodox shul where they were having an Oneg Shabbat on a Friday night about the exhibition and about Shabbat. And that was all great, that was fine, until a week before the event was meant to be held, I got notification that it had been cancelled. Now, to be honest, I wasn't too upset about this, because I'd actually had some other plans come up with some friends that I was going to have to miss out on because I was going to speak at this thing. So, okay, fine, no problem, we'll leave it at that. A couple of days later, just a few days before the event, I got the notification that it was back on. So this is all very strange. Now, I can't remember, it must have been before it actually happened. I ended up getting pulled aside by someone I worked with at the Jewish Museum, and they said, Rebecca, you know, someone told me I shouldn't tell you this, but I think you're a big girl and you should know. But the reason that the event was cancelled was the rabbi got wind of the fact that you're a lesbian, and he didn't think it was okay that you come and speak at the shul. And I said, what did he think I was going to talk about? Like radical lesbian interpretations of Shabbat? Like, seriously, like what's the problem? I just didn't get it. By this time, as you remember, the event had been put back on again. But I, having heard this, said, you know what, stuff him. I'm not coming to speak now. I'm going to cancel on him. And then, in about 2 minutes, I did a complete turnaround in my head again and I said, hang on a sec, no way am I going to give him the satisfaction of not turning up at his Oneg Shabbat and speaking about Shabbat. I'm going to go, because I suddenly realised that if I didn't turn up, then that would let him have the victory. And I said, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be a lesbian, I'm going to be Jewish, I'm not going to say anything controversial because there's nothing controversial to say about Shabbat. I'm going to be there and he's going to see that there's absolutely no problem with it. And so I did. And I spoke, and it was fine. I have to say it was a little uncomfortable when he came up and spoke to me, but I tried to do my best and be nice and nod my head and thank him for having me speaking in there. So again, as I said, aside from that, that's really the only incident that I've ever faced in my time working in the Jewish community. Now, notwithstanding about what I've just said about everything generally being fine in my time working in the Jewish community, I do have to say that I only first spoke publicly as and about being a lesbian about 3 years ago. Now, this might not be unusual for some people, but for me, I do a lot of public speaking. I talk a lot about all sorts of issues to do with gender and feminism in Judaism, but I'd never spoken about myself as a lesbian or about lesbian sexuality in Jewish tradition. Even though I was really out in my day-to-day life, I still did carry around some anxiety about speaking publicly about this topic. And even though I kind of assume that everyone knows that I'm a lesbian, either thanks to the highly effective gossip channels that operate in our community or because of my hairstyle, which I assume that everyone reads as being a lesbian hairstyle, I still always felt that it would be very exposing for me to speak publicly about my sexuality and retain some underlying fear that there might be negative implications for me. However, increasingly I became bothered by a gnawing feeling that by not speaking publicly, by almost quite conspicuously omitting something about myself when I speak publicly, I was to some extent colluding with those in the community who would prefer not to hear or see homosexuality in the Jewish community, particularly in leadership positions. I think pretending not to be there rather than taking my usual stance of claiming boldly, I'm here, you get used to it, that I've been talking about throughout this evening. So 3 years ago, the opportunity presented itself when I spoke at Limud Oz, which many of you may have been to in the past, on a panel. I spoke specifically about lesbianism in halakha, and I'll be presenting a workshop about that afterwards. And I started there with a personal introduction about my own story. And I have to say that it was extremely empowering for me to speak openly about this topic, and I didn't have any negative responses, and I didn't have anyone saying anything bad. In fact, if anything, I only had positive responses and people coming up to me saying that it was great to hear me speak about that. And in fact, I think that that's a common message and a common experience that a lot of people have. I think when you speak openly and confidently and you adopt that attitude, I think that that in itself has a positive impact. I think first of all, just your presence speaking is powerful. It's a cliche, but true. I think that homophobia and many other forms of hatred and racism often just arise from ignorance. People just don't know anyone who is gay or lesbian or trans or from another ethnic background. They don't know what they're like, and so often their hatred and their attitudes arises from that ignorance. And I think often just being around someone, seeing them, seeing that it's okay, seeing that someone who is a lesbian, is gay, is trans, can also be committed to being Jewish and to being part of the Jewish community, in itself, just that presence sends a powerful message. I think, secondly, speaking openly about this topic, for me, made me realise how much it draws out and empowers the silent majority. Because I do think that there are a lot of the people out there often listening who are okay and don't think that it's okay, the kind of negative attitudes and treatment that there are in the community. And I think it gives them the confidence to speak out. And the more and more that they hear and see other people, the more they feel like it's okay for themselves to speak positively themselves. In the last few years in the Jewish community, I have to say I've become even more public about being a lesbian, especially since having a baby. As anyone who's lesbian or gay will tell you, when they have a child, they come out over and over and over again, because you're constantly getting asked about who's the father, and does the father have blonde hair and blue eyes? Because I certainly don't. And so you have to do that again. It's hard to hide being pregnant. And then, of course, when the baby comes and you become one of those annoying people who feels compelled to talk about every minute detail of your child's development, it inevitably comes up that, yes, your child has two mums and not a mum and a dad. But I have to say, even through this period of like increased exposure and outing of myself, I have to say that I've only ever had positive responses. I found particularly at the museum where I work, not only has everyone wished me mazel tov wholeheartedly on having a baby, but every second person says to me, oh yes, my granddaughter, she's a lesbian too, or my son and his partner who live in England, they just adopted a baby. So all of these people kind of come out of the woodwork with their own stories as well. So thirdly, the final sphere that I want to talk about, that Gavi was really talking about quite a lot as well, the third sphere about where is it possible to be both Jewish and lesbian is really within the context of Jewish religious tradition. How is it possible, the question might arise, is it possible to remain Jewish when there are clearly prohibitions against homosexuality in biblical and rabbinic traditions? Now, for me personally, I have to say, I'm not an observant, strictly observant Jew by any means. So what halakha has to say about my sexual life really doesn't matter that much to me on a personal level. I don't feel the weight of halakhic prohibition in my daily life in that sense, the same way that I'm not observant in many other respects and I don't take on halakhic prohibitions in many other aspects of my life. That said, though, Jewish tradition is important to me, and I do have a great deal of respect for the system of Jewish law. So I have on a couple of occasions found myself in the position of having to negotiate the Jewish religious law in the context of my own personal life. And I have to say again, I have found the rabbis who I've encountered and who've been the representatives of Jewish law in these situations very welcoming. Now, I never really wanted to get married, so I haven't had to deal with that particular issue in the context of Jewish life. But I have encountered certain things with the birth of my son. Debbie and I both wanted our son to be circumcised, and we ended up using an Orthodox mohel, circumciser. And there were a number of halachic issues that came up in the context of our child not having a father who was present. Obviously, he has a biological father, but not a father who's actively involved in his life at this stage. So there are a number of issues that came up about what would our son be named, because traditionally a son is named after his father. So he would have been Felix Ben, the name of his father. And also who said the blessing, who would say the blessing at the time of the circumcision, because traditionally it is the father who actually circumcises the son and recites the blessing when the son's circumcised. I actually consulted the mohel we used was willing to take advice from Rabbi Ralph Genendi, and I want to name him because I want to thank him, and I take every opportunity to publicly acknowledge him for his wisdom and his generosity. He consulted with a rabbinic colleague in Israel, and he found ways to deal with these issues in a way that was very sensitive and inclusive, whereas I actually got to say the blessing over my son's circumcision, and we actually decided that he wasn't going to be named Ben anything because he could be named Ben Rivka, Felix Ben Rivka, but I didn't want to exclude my partner from being named as a parent in that context. The same way if I'd been a woman, a straight woman, and I'd had a husband, I would have been extremely offended at having myself been excluded at the moment when my son was named as well. So he was just named in his own right. So we ended up finding solutions to that. We also had a Pidyon HaBen ceremony, redemption of the firstborn son, which is a rather obscure and little practice ceremony these days, but we did it, and in this time I have to acknowledge Rabbi Adam Stein, who's here tonight, from the conservative Shul Keilat Nitzan, who helped us find a way to adapt the Pidyon HaBen ceremony in a way that was inclusive of having two mothers. I don't know that the Sephardi Pidyon HaBen ceremony that includes a mother in the ceremony envisioned ever having two mothers, but at least it opened up the possibility of a woman being present, involved in the ceremony. Rabbi Stein also had myself and my partner, together with our baby Felix, called up at Shul shortly after he was born, which was a really beautiful experience for all of us. Now, of course, I'm aware that still in the Orthodox part of the community, as Gavi has told us, mentioned quite a bit about, all of these issues are still very much an issue. And although they're not my issue, because I do respect the halachic system, and I believe that at its best, it has its capacity to be inclusive, open and lenient, I do seek out, admire and advocate the work of scholars and activists in the Orthodox community who engage deeply with texts and find new interpretations that make space for GLBTI Jews. I want to just mention, for example, some things that I'm inspired by, the stories of two Jewish Orthodox women in this book, Keep Your Wives Away from Them, Orthodox Women, Unorthodox Desires, who come from what we might call here in Melbourne a Mizrahi community, but ended up having a Jewish commitment ceremony in Brooklyn Gardens with their families and their friends. I'm inspired by this book, Torah Queries, a book that presents readings of the weekly Parashat HaShavua from a queer perspective by people who are committed to engaging with the text and to claiming ownership of them. I'm inspired by the work of Rabbi Steve Greenberg, an openly gay Orthodox rabbi who's written extensively about rereadings of the biblical prohibition of male homosexual activity. In conclusion, I want to quote from one other book that I haven't brought here, but it's a book called Queer Jews by editors David Schneer and Karen Aviv, who write in their introduction of two earlier anthologies which were groundbreaking at their time, published in the late 1980s, Nice Jewish Girls, who anyone involved with the Jewish lesbian group or was a Jewish lesbian back then will know, and Twice Blessed on Being Lesbian, Gay and Jewish. These books were profoundly influential in their time and were published, Schneer and Aviv write in their introduction, in an era when, for many, Jewish identity and sexual identity were still seen as opposing one another. By the early 20th century, gay and lesbian Jews were coming of age, they wrote, in a visible, empowered, unapologetically queer culture. While an earlier generation was still embroiled in trying to reconcile their identities and were less concerned, and I quote again, with the privileges of heterosexuality like marriage, family and other institutions of Jewish culture, now the voices in queer Jews claim those institutions as our own entitlements. In the 1990s, queer Jews were grateful for the honour of being allowed to be Reform rabbis. In the new millennium, queer Jews demand nothing less than the right to be married by those rabbis. Now, it's often said that Australia's Jewish community is a generation or so behind America, and in this area I think we may probably still have some catching up to do. However, a lot has changed in our community, certainly over the past 10 to 20 years that I've seen, and I think continues to change rapidly, certainly from some of the stories we heard at the beginning this evening. Forums like today are a great positive step, providing a space for us all to declare proudly, we are here. We are gay, lesbian, bi, trans and intersex, and we're Jewish. And the Jewish community must, and I have faith eventually will, quite simply get used to it. Thank you.
Everyone that's come here today, I want to thank in particular the presenters, Gavi and Rebecca and Sally and Margot and Sam and Sean. And I'd like to, and I don't think I missed anyone, I'd also like to thank people, those who led the workshops, and Wayne and Jonathan and Neville, and I'd also like to thank the office of the JCCV as well, who's tirelessly worked very, very hard to get all this organised, and the executive under the leadership of Jennifer. And the successive ones as well, who's been very, very supportive of LGBTI inclusion. So thank you all today for coming, and enjoy. Have a good week.
I'd also like to acknowledge the work that Doron has done in making this evening happen. Doron has been involved with the LGBTI reference group for a number of years, but joined our executive in November last year, so he's been prepared to put his hand up and work within the community to try and make the community more inclusive. So I think that a big hand to go to Doron for the work that he's done there. And thank you all for coming.